So, what happens when we take a classic tragedy about immortal beings and literally flip the whole thing on its head? Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really profound narrative inversion. We're turning a story about the absolute burden of eternal life into a comedy about mortals actually learning to want to live. Think about it. If an immortal's tragedy focuses on the sheer weight of infinite memory and this desperate, gnawing desire to finally just experience an ending, what happens when we completely reverse that exact premise? Well, to start, we really have to shift our entire emotional center. Normally, in these stories, an immortal's tragedy treats eternity like a prison, right? Accumulating memories is a burden, loss is an unbearable wound, and forever is basically just a trap. But to reverse this, we have to imagine a world where loss is actually a gift, where forgetting is the real wound, and where the simple fact that we cannot stop dying is the exact thing that makes our lives actually mean something. Now, what's really fascinating here is that we're actually using the original Greek sense of the word comedy. We aren't talking about punchlines or lightness just for the sake of it. In the classic sense, comedy is a form that moves toward connection. It moves toward integration. Greek comedy points toward completion. It ends in arrivals, in weddings, in this grand realization that the universe is fundamentally generative, not terminal. So a comedy of mortals is all about radically, absurdly finite people discovering the extraordinary, almost unbearable preciousness of a life that actually ends. Let's ground this with a story. Step into the archive of incomplete things. Here we meet Eva. She's an archivist working in this very quiet library in Prague that's just filled to the brim with fragmented texts. Now, officially, the library has some terribly bureaucratic name, but everybody who works there just calls it torso, the Czech word for torso, something that was once whole and now, well, isn't. It's the place where objects go when they simply aren't complete enough for anywhere else. And Eva? She basically spends her days surrounded by partial manuscripts, water-damaged books, and letters missing half their pages. She's essentially acting as a professional mourner for interrupted conversations. Just imagine Eva's current project for a second. It's an 18th century manuscript, but here's the kicker. Pages 88 through 209 were completely wiped out by a 19th century Austrian flood. So the surviving text just suddenly resumes on page 211, picking up right in the middle of a sentence, right in the absolute middle of this incredibly complex philosophical thought about the very existence of the soul. And honestly, this just brilliantly illustrates what we could call the tragedy of the mid-sentence gap. As Eva realizes, just because those specific pages washed away in a flood, it doesn't mean the author didn't carefully think those thoughts. The sentence hasn't been erased. It's just been permanently separated from its own conclusion. And, if you've ever lost someone suddenly, you know exactly what this feels like. You're just left standing there, holding the first half of a conversation. That kind of sudden loss, it fundamentally shifts your reality. And that's exactly what we see happening at the Namici Miru grief group. Eva goes there on Tuesday nights. The group is specifically for people who have crossed a very clear line. They've moved from just intellectually knowing they'll die someday, which, is tucked away in a mental file drawer for most of us, to having a sudden, raw, visceral awareness of it in their bones. This is usually triggered by a deep loss, and this new awareness radically, totally alters how they experience time and orient themselves in the world. Take Filip, for example. He's a landscape architect in the group who lost his sister, Jana. In the depths of his grief, Filip drops off 40 anonymous notebooks that actively, almost aggressively, reject the standard consolations of mortality. He didn't want to hear the usual comforting phrases, stuff about the beautiful cycles of nature or the so-called gift of urgency. No, he wanted to argue for mortality as the correct design, not a tragedy you just have to endure. Instead, Filip's true argument is this massive philosophical inversion. He realizes that a life without an end isn't actually a life at all. It's basically just extending pigment infinitely across a giant canvas. Meaning requires a frame. Think about that for a second. An experience without a conclusion is just exposure. When Filip looks at his sister's short life, he comes to this profound realization that it was actually complete. It wasn't long, sure, but it was a life. Because it ended, it has a shape. It has edges. He can actually hold it in his mind like a stone. Exploring this architecture of grief brings us to a really powerful realization about how we carry loss. Andre, an older librarian at Torso who spent years cataloging incomplete things, figured out that holding onto the dead dynamically isn't about letting grief drag you down like this heavy, unbearable weight. It's actually about using it as ballast. It's what keeps you upright and steady when the water gets rough. It's the absolute difference between being paralyzed by the past and being supported by it. We see this dynamic movement perfectly embodied by Carolina. Her late husband died literally two-thirds of the way through reading a novel. Now, instead of just leaving his bookmark frozen in place forever like some museum exhibit, Carolina actually reads the rest of it. She discovers that she is reading for both of them now. She's acting as a proxy, carrying his interests, his memory, and his way of experiencing the world forward into the ongoing experience of life, into the winters that he won't get to see. Now let's look at this through a brilliant bookbinding metaphor from Petra, another archivist at Torzo. Think about a tightly bound, early modern rigid spine. Sure, it might look absolutely perfect sitting on a shelf forever, but it cracks the second you actually try to open and read it. It preserves the object, but at the total cost of its function. A flexible spine, on the other hand, is literally designed to be stressed. It fully accepts that the price of being opened, of truly being experienced, is its own eventual wear and tear. So, if we look back at the immortals, their whole strategy of using indifference to survive eternity, it's actually a form of amputation. Sure, they preserve themselves forever, but they completely lose the capacity to be open to meaning. Mortals don't have that option. We are forced to be flexible. We have to accept the wear and tear of loss, because it is literally the only way to genuinely open ourselves up to connection. And this leads to Mosh, the philosopher in the grief group, to map out a really crucial dilemma. Is mortal love just immortal love, but with a time limit? Looking at it, the group realizes, no way, it's fundamentally different in kind. Mortal love isn't just more intense, it has the knowledge of its own finiteness baked right into its very structure. The ending isn't just some external condition imposed on the relationship from the outside. The ending is a core, constitutive element of the love itself. Now, returning to the archive, something incredible happens. Eva miraculously recovers 62 of those missing pages. After months of searching, she finally gets scans of the pages lost in that 19th century flood. And it reveals the 18th century author's conclusion, written while his own wife was actually dying. He concludes that the self is simply our lived experience of persisting through time. The soul's existence is proven by its awareness of its own duration. Therefore, a life that ends isn't erased. It has fully existed because it experienced its own duration. The ending is just the final completion of that shape. Which brings us to the absolute ultimate realization of this explainer. The highest act of love among mortals is choosing connection with full, unblinking knowledge of its cost. The members of the grief group realized they wouldn't trade their time with their loved ones, not even for a second, just to avoid the pain of losing them. The most profound thing a mortal can do is look at the absolute certainty of an ending and say, yes, even knowing exactly how much this will hurt, I would still choose to do it all over again. The even knowing I would still. So, to wrap this up, I want to leave you with one final, provocative question about how you choose to frame the finite, beautiful duration of your own life. We've seen how the frame gives meaning to the painting, right? How the flexible spine allows the book to actually be read, and how the edge of a life is what makes it something you can hold on to. So as you go forward into your own ongoing story, ask yourself, would you still choose the connection, even knowing exactly how it ends? Are you fully opening yourself up, even knowing the cost? Thanks for exploring this brilliant inversion of tragedy with me. Keep seeking out the complete shapes in your own life.